as a politician that he came from Windy Gap, North Carolina. This young man, his name was Hubert Hyde, but everybody called him Hub for short. And once he was in adulthood, he ran for the North Carolina State Congress, and he was elected, but he was telling some other congressmen that he was just a little bit embarrassed because as a politician, it wasn't very good to admit that he came from Windy Gap, North Carolina. Said, you know, being a politician from Windy Gap is not a very good combination. But in case you're wondering,
he wrote a book too, didn't he?
Oh, yes, he did. It was a wonderful book all about his childhood and growing up in these mountains. And it's also a lot about his family. He had a whole slew of uncles and aunts. But this is what's so amazing, what Hub says, what he had already observed as a really, really young boy. He noticed that on his mama's side, a lot of her brothers were very, very serious-minded, revival-preaching Baptist ministers. But yet, on his daddy's side, a lot of his brothers were very, very serious-minded, big-time moonshine makers. But I love the way Hub puts it. He says, either way, they were both in the spirit. But Hub has just a very good, witty way of putting things. And that, you see it in his book. But it's really funny about the large family he had, and yet the variety in that family. So, if I could, what I'd like to do is share a little bit about Hub and some of his family members. And Hub's mama had a great, great faith, a very strong faith, grew up as a Baptist. And faith was her passion. Now, Hub's daddy, on the other hand, he had 36 hound dogs. So it's not too difficult to know what was his daddy's passion. It was hunting. And he would go day or night. It's so funny because Hub says, as a very, very young boy, he said, Daddy and I, he said, if we could go hunting 8 days a week, we would. And which would you, as a young boy, want to do most? Go to church with Mama or go out in the woods hunting with all the hound dogs? So Hub joined the hunting club. Well, I want to also tell you a story about Christmas time at Hub's home and an annual Christmas tradition. And this will tell us a little bit about Hub's Granny Googe. Okay? Now, Granny Googe was his mama's mother. So, when it was getting to be very, very close to Christmas Day, it was a tradition to hear a knock on the door. And, of course, you'd go answer the door, and there stood Granny Googe. She would walk from her home to their home, and she would be spending a week. She always spent exactly 7 days, no more, no less. And Hub couldn't help but notice, as just a small young boy, that the first day he saw Granny Googe on the porch, there she was in all 7 of her dresses. You see, Granny Goose packed herself because she had no suitcases, she had no satchel or luggage, so when it was time for her to go for a visit, she'd wear all 7 of her dresses. And then, pretty smart actually, she never needed a coat. And then when she got into her little room where she would spend the week, she'd take off 6 of them, wear a different dress every day, and the very last day, the 7th day, when it was time for her to make the trek back home, here she was decked out with all 7 of her dresses back on, and she was ready to make the trip home. So, you know how sometimes as a child you knew there were certain things you shouldn't say, and you might get in trouble if you said them, but you wanted to say them anyway because you felt, I don't care, it's worth it. Well, children are children in the 1800s, the 1900s, and the 20th century, or the 21st century. Okay, so Hub, he knew he'd get in trouble for this, but it was just a few days before Christmas and Granny Goose's annual visit. And so Hub's mother said to him, now, Hub, I want you to get your room cleaned up and everything really nice because in just a day or 2, Granny is going to be here and we want the house to look really, really nice and we want her room to look very, very clean. And he knew he'd get in trouble, but he couldn't resist it. He says, Granny Goose with her 7 dresses? She said, yep, that's the one, Hub. He said, oh, I call her my Granny Snow White and her 7 drawers. Well, true to form, he did get a good licking for that one. Now, I want to talk about just one of his uncles, okay? And this was his uncle. Actually, I really should say it was his great uncle, Uncle Quill Rose. Now, Quill lived right on the North Carolina-Tennessee border in an area called Eagle Creek. Now, you may not be familiar with that name, Quill Rose, but he had a very, very good friend, and they would go out bear hunting for days at a time. And that friend's name was Horace Gephardt. And that may be a gentleman that you're aware of. Well, Quill Rose loved to hunt. But he had another passion in life, and that was to make shine. All right. And do you know, in the 1890s to about 1910, Quill Rose was known as the biggest and the best moonshine maker in the Smoky Mountains. But a couple things we have to remember. This is before the days of automobiles. So it's not as if Quill has moonshine runners, ridge runners, that he has hired to move the shine for him. And also, we have to remember that in addition to that, he didn't call his corn liquor or his corn squeezins, corn whiskey, moonshine, unlike all the other people that were making shine. It was strong. When Quill Rose made a batch of moonshine, it was about 180 proof, 90% alcohol. In fact, it was so strong that back in the 1890s, there was a saying about Quill Rose's moonshine. They'd say that the buzzards have to fly an extra mile high when they go by Quill Rose's cabin just to stay sober. So if he didn't call his shine, his corn liquor, moonshine, what did he call it? He had two names for his corn squeezins. One was gut rot, and one was scorpion juice. And once in a while, he also would jokingly say, tanglefoot, because he said, drink enough of it, you're bound to get tangle-footed. Well, you know, it was good, strong corn liquor or scorpion juice. And do you know, he looked at it like this. Making tanglefoot could not possibly be illegal. It just couldn't be. Because corn is a gift from God. And what he did with his corn, with his gift from God, could not possibly be any of the government's business. So, unlike so many of the other people who were making corn squeezins, he never ever hid his still. He was a man of integrity, and as he bragged, he was a man of his word. And if he was not doing anything wrong, which he didn't believe he was, why would there possibly be any need to hide anything? So he kept his still right in front of his cabin. It was never hid in a thicket or a hellion of roadies down by the stream. Well, it was good corn liquor. And one of the reasons it was known to be so good is he would double and triple foot it. Now, just in case you're not familiar with what I mean by that, every time you would run the corn squeezins through the worm or the condensing coil, that was known as footin'. So if you ran it through twice, that was double footin'. If it was 3 times, it was triple footin'. And each time it was reducing any impurities and making it stronger and stronger. And there was a way to immediately identify if the corn liquor you just bought was double-footed or triple-footed, and you could tell by the number of X's on the jug. Every time the maker of the shine ran it through the coil another time, you put another X on the jug. So that X was not there just for decoration. There was actually a purpose behind it. Well, you know that he makes a lot of corn squeezins. So much so that when he sells some of his squeezins, he sells it for a gallon size, was what he would measure out. A pure full gallon would set you back a whole $1. Well, he doesn't try to hide the fact that this is how he's making his living. And so he's going to run into some trouble with the law. Not just once or twice, but many, many a time. And he'd often be hauled off and actually taken into court. Well, this happened several times, and one time when he was at a federal court, and the Judge Felix, talked to him, and he said, "You, Mr. Quill Rose, are guilty of making corn whiskey. How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty? Quill's response, maybe. The judge didn't know what to do, so he said, Quill, pay your usual $3 and come up to the bench now. And Quill, very dutifully, respectfully, came up to the bench. And he thought he was going to get a few choice words from Judge Felix. But he didn't. Instead, the judge whispered something. He said, Quill, I gotta tell you this. Sort of funny, he says, didn't want anybody else in the courtroom to hear what he was saying. I know I have to fine you, so put your money down, but while you're up here, I also have to compliment you because I tried your corn liquor, and of all the people in the Smoky Mountains, I do believe it was the best that I have ever had. But I also have a request. Have you ever thought that maybe you should try aging some of your corn squeezings? Maybe it would be like fine wine and would actually get better with time. Have you ever thought about that, Quill? He said, oh yes, I have, Judge. I have thought about it and I have tried it. I want to tell you, I had a batch of shine and I decided that I would age that one batch for a whole week just to see if it made a bit of difference. It didn't. No truth to any of it, Judge. So he goes back and he knows no other way of life. So he goes straight back to his still because basically what he made off of his corn liquor sales was far greater than any of his fines. Plus, Mr. Quill Rose was a very community-minded man, and he felt he was providing a very good service to his community because, unlike some other moonshine makers, he wasn't taking any shortcuts. He was giving a very high quality product. He would never ever dream of taking other shortcuts like other people and maybe, using different things like an old radiator when cars came out and, using them for the worm, and you then expose everybody to potential poisoning, lead poisoning and blindness. No, he was quite a respectable man in his community, and he took great pride in a good product and in keeping his word. And this other story about Quill shows that. I want to tell you about that. He was out in the front yard and a revenuer came to visit him one day, and he said, Mr. Rose, once again you've been making shine and I have to arrest you, and I'm going to take you in to jail, and then tomorrow morning you can appear in court. And Quill said, well, I'm not going today, but I will come tomorrow and I will be there. And the revenuer did not know Quill. This was his first time to meet him, so he had no idea. And he said, no, Mr. Rose, you will be going with me right now. And the revenuer took out his pistol and he pointed it at Quill Rose and he said, let's go. you don't point a pistol at Quill Rose. And not only that, the revenue had no idea that Quill Rose was a man of great, great physical strength. So, Quill Rose walks over to the revenuer, pulls the pistol out of his hand, and he simply picks it up and he knocks him over the head with it. Knocks him over the head so hard that it knocks the revenuer unconscious, which is exactly what Quill wanted. He wasn't going to kill him, but he was going to put him down for a while. So Quill picks him up and he carries him to the revenuer's horse. And he picks him up, flings him over the saddle, then he ties his hands and his feet together, and then he gives his horse a good swat on the back end and heads him back into town. The next morning at 7 o'clock, Quill Rose was at the train depot at Proctor, exactly when and where he told that revenuer he would be. So at 7 o'clock, the revenuer comes looking for him. But Quill was in better shape than the revenuer was, because he was still limping when he got to Quill. But Quill was one of the fascinating characters of the Smokies. And I also want to tell you about another one of Hub Hyde's uncles. And this one was a Baptist preacher and evangelist. So this was on his mama's side. This was Uncle Lige. Now can you imagine having all these people in your family? What a get-together Christmas family reunion would have been like. Would have just been a feast for the ears and eyes, I think. And so anyway, Uncle Lige, well, he travels throughout the Smokies, Tennessee, the Carolinas, holding revivals. And back then, we've got to understand, it didn't matter if you were Presbyterian, if you were Baptist or Methodist. When a revival was held, whether it was at a brush arbor or a tent down by the river or a very, very simple cabin, wood frame structure, everybody in town showed up because it was something to do. It was activity. And so Uncle Lige, since it's Hub's uncle, his mom's brother, as he plans to have revivals around the Windy Gap area, he naturally is going to stay at Hub's home. And so they have revivals at a church. It is the Rock Creek Primitive Baptist Church of Windy Gap. So Sunday after church, very, very common tradition, they have fried chicken for dinner. Well, that was typical. You always had fried chicken Sundays after church. And Hub never thought a thing about it. But then, Monday night, before the revivals, they had fried chicken. And as a young boy, Hub thought, this is really, really strange. Chicken again? Well, Tuesday night, time for supper, right before the revival once again, and it's fried chicken. Wednesday night, the same thing. And Hub is a young boy. He just could not, after that, he couldn't keep quiet. Wednesday night came around and he blurted it out. He said, Uncle Lige, how long is this revival gonna last? Because if we keep it up, we're gonna run out of chickens. And well, Uncle Lige, he said, "Huh? You know, this just isn't something I can tell you, because it isn't up to me. It all depends on just how long the Spirit keeps moving." But Hub told his uncle, he says, "I don't know. I've been out to the chicken coop, and we only have a couple chickens left." Hub thought to himself, "Well, I might not be getting saved, but I sure am eating well. I like these revivals." But you know, it was funny, after that warning, sure enough, the very next day, the Spirit stopped stirring, and the chickens were done being fried up in the pan. Well, Uncle Lige, when he held revivals, did such a wonderful job. It was typical for them to last a week or two, and while a pastor was in the area holding revivals, up until even the 1940s, it was very, very common that you would cancel school, the mill would be closed, the store would be closed, because it was so important that everybody went to revival time. And you have to remember too, there was a session in the morning, there was a session in the afternoon, and there was the evening session. So it was pretty much an all-day affair. Well, Uncle Lige was liked so much that he was asked to come back and be the full-time permanent pastor at the Rock Creek Primitive Baptist Church. And so he was delighted. He could be close to his family. He could settle down. He wouldn't be on the horse all the time. And so he came and became the pastor. And one of the things that was a tradition for many, many years at Rock Creek Primitive Baptist was to have communion, or the Lord's Supper. And because they only held communion one night out of the entire year, it was always on a Sunday night, and it was every year in the fall, after all the crops had been brought in and people weren't quite so busy anymore. And it was a big talk of the town, so to speak, and everybody showed up for the Lord's Supper. And I'll tell you why. Unlike a lot of the Primitive Baptist churches in the area, Rock Creek Primitive Baptist did not have grape juice. They had grape wine. So that was a really, really big draw. And people who had not been in church for the whole year showed up that Sunday night for the Lord's Supper, of course. Well, what's sort of interesting is it was another one of Hub's relatives. It was his cousin Tom who would always provide the wine every year for the Lord's Supper. Well, his cousin Tom forgot to tell Pastor Lige that his grapes had not hit that year, nothing produced, and he had no wine. And he never said a word about it till the service. So, when Pastor Lige preaches his message and announces that it is now time for the Lord's Supper, and would Tom bring up the wine? Oh no. Tom, it's like, now what do I do? What's wrong? I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you. I don't have any wine. And the pastor said, "No wine? How can we have the Lord's Supper?" And I tell you, when the congregation, the people there that night, heard that there was no wine, there was the loudest moan ever heard at Rock Creek Primitive Baptist, more than any long-lost sinner ever coming to the altar. It was a night of moaning. Everyone was in despair. Now, what were we going to do? Well, luckily, Hub, he seems to have an endless supply of uncles. Well, his other uncle was Uncle Hyde. And Uncle Hyde also goes to Rock Creek Primitive Baptist Church, and he happens to live right next to the church. And so he sort of waves from the back of the church and he tells his brother, well, we don't have great wine, but I have some wine that I made and I'll be glad to bring it over. And since I'm right next to the church, I'll just run over and run right back. Oh, whew. Everybody in the church breathed a sigh of relief. There may be some hope after all. So we can redeem this night. So he goes to his house and he brings the wine. And he took a minute, just long enough, because whenever you have communion, how they would do it, they had a 2-gallon wooden bucket. So that's what he put his wine in, into the 2-gallon bucket, and he remembered to bring along with him that gourd dipper. And so, being the pastor, well, of course, you know that Uncle Lige, he got first honors. And so he took a whole great big, he filled that dipper up, and he took a great big gulp of that wine. And from there, it was passed by the ushers. Nobody got up. Nobody went to the altar like you do today many times. Instead, they simply passed that same wooden bucket, that same one gourd dipper, up and down, every pew from the front to the back. Of course, germs hadn't been invented back then, so it wasn't an issue for anybody. And chances are maybe that one was strong enough, you never know, it might kill anything. Well, anyway, so they passed the wine around, but Hub, being just a very small little boy, little Schaefer at the time, he couldn't take himself a swig of that. But he watched as people in front of him and the pastor up at the pulpit and others started. And he couldn't help but notice that after Uncle Lige had had that first swig of wine, that his mouth was starting to pucker up a little. And then it was starting to flinch a little over to the right. And after just a little bit of time, somehow his uncle's mouth was not under his nose at this moment in time. It had moved, Hub says, under his right ear. He thought, how could that be? How could you ever make your face get so twisted? Well, then Hub looked over at his mother. What was happening to her mouth? Same thing, twisting all over to the right. Well, all of a sudden he looked around and the whole congregation that night had become one big flinching flock. And what he realized, and what his Uncle Hyde never told anybody, is that his wine was made from green persimmons. Oh, well, nobody forgot that night. And so Uncle Lige got up, and after everybody had had their communion wine, Uncle Lige makes his last announcement. He said, well, we normally always close our Lord's Supper with a parting hymn. That hymn being Whispering Hope. But I think tonight, as we leave, we'll just whistle as we leave. And as Hub said, that's the night at Rock Creek Primitive Baptist Church, Whistling Hope replaced Whispering Hope. Rock Creek Primitive Baptist Church. I wish I could have been there. Don't you wish that, Lew?
Oh, yes. What a family.
Oh, amazing.